Everyone. I'd like to thank for joining Asan-CCGA, the webinar on title is Preventing Nuclear Proliferation and Reassuring America's Allies. I am Chegang, Vice President of Asan Institute. I just jump in to say the start word of this webinar. So this will be moderated by Chairman Han Sung-ju. Everybody knows him well, so he's very well-known practitioner, scholar, and leader in Korea, as well as in other parts of the world. Without further ado, let me ask Chairman Han Sung-ju say a few words for introduction.
Thank you very much, Dr. Che. I'm pleased to open this Asan-Chicago Council web seminar meeting on preventing nuclear proliferation and reassuring American allies. As you all know, this is the result of very thoughtful deliberation on the subject by experienced, insightful, and wise persons organized by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs with the leadership of its president, Ambassador Ivo Dollar, my good friend. The task force report was finished only a few weeks ago, which we will discuss today. Two of the members of the task force will be participating in the seminar. One person is General Scaparotti, who was the Supreme Commander, former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe and Commander US Forces, Korea. The other person, Korean, is Minister Yoon Byung-se. He was Minister of Foreign Affairs until 2 years ago. I have, with the shortage of time, just 3 questions I hope our participants will have in mind as they make presentations and conduct discussions. The first is about the title of the project, which links preventing nuclear proliferation and on one hand, and reassuring America's allies on the other. Is it 2 related items or items that are having some causation to each other? The second question has to do with a comparison between the situation in Europe and in Asia. For one thing, Europe has NATO. Asia does not have a security mechanism such as NATO, although there are some other loosely organized, not really organizations, but dialogue or exercises. The third is obviously the implications of this report to Korea, to the Korean situation, to the North Korean nuclear weapons, and what South Korea, together with the United States, can do to deal with it. So with this introduction, I trust and hope that the webinar we will have today with experts, particularly including its authors with their insights and wisdom, will shed light to how we enhance our sense of security and reduce our sense of insecurity. So let us now turn first to General Curtis M. Scaparotti, former Supreme Allied Commander, Europe, and Commander of the U.S. Forces, Korea. General Scaparotti, please.
Minister Hahn, thank you. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes,
you
we
hear
can
me
hear you
clearly?
very clearly. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm pleased to participate in this important webinar on preventing nuclear proliferation and reassuring American allies. And it's a particular privilege to join two great statesmen that I've had the privilege to work with in the past, Minister Hahn and Minister Yoon. So it's good to see you both as well. I want to thank the Asan Institute and Chicago Council on Global Affairs for making this webinar possible and sponsoring it. Now, the task force that you mentioned met for the first time in person just over a year ago at the Munich Security Conference. In that first meeting, we discussed the history of nuclear nonproliferation and our concerns as allies in Europe and Asia, confronted by growing military threats from a resurgent Russia, a rising China, and a nuclear North Korea. In the next 7 minutes, I'll do my best to summarize the task force's reports and that report's key points here. In the early 1960s, intelligence officials projected that by the mid-1970s, there would likely be 10 to 15 nuclear powers in the world within a decade. And the US President John F. Kennedy actually warned about just such a proliferated world. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968 successfully prevented this, in large part because of the concerted US effort since the 1960s to reassure its allies around the world that America's nuclear umbrella would extend to their territory and ensure their security. Since the NPT entered into force in 1970, just 4 countries, India, Israel, Pakistan, and North Korea, have acquired nuclear weapons. However, I can affirm from my recent time in uniform, questions about the credibility of the American nuclear guarantee have arisen again in Europe and Asia, as our allies face growing military threats from Russia, China, and a nuclear North Korea. At the same time, successive US administrations have sought to retreat from longstanding commitments, leaving America's allies around the world uncertain whether they can still rely on the United States. Therefore, 2 fundamental conclusions in the report are as follows. First, in order to prevent new nuclear proliferation among these allies, it is essential to acknowledge that what has long been unthinkable, the idea that threat of nuclear proliferation, is becoming thinkable once again, or once more. Although the Biden administration has pledged to reaffirm longstanding US security commitments to its allies, a change in administration alone is unlikely to reestablish the credibility of the US security guarantee, including a nuclear umbrella, in the eyes of most allies. In light of this reality, I'll now briefly cover the task force recommendations with a focus on Asia. To your point, Minister Hahn, yes, there is a relationship in the title that the strength of the allies, that our nuclear guarantee is actually tied to the non-proliferation, particularly among our allies, to the extent that our nuclear extension and our guarantee is trusted. So now rebuilding US leadership. The US can take 3 major steps to rebuild confidence in the US security commitments to its allies, including recommitting to extended nuclear deterrence. First, the President of the United States should reaffirm the foundational cornerstones of America's security commitments, including reaffirming its treaty-based collective defense commitments unequivocally, reverse the decision to remove US troops from Germany and elsewhere, and negotiate long-term balanced cost-sharing arrangements with US forces based in Europe and Asia. On this last point, I note the administration's quick, along with the Republic of Korea, together, but the quick and successful negotiation with the Republic of Korea on a mutually acceptable multi-year special measures agreement. Very important, I think. Second, the US needs to proactively raise the salience of nuclear weapons issues in its alliance relations, including by bringing allies into the nuclear planning process from the outset, increasing alliance crisis management exercises, and involving alliance leaders at the highest level in nuclear and regular wargaming. And then finally, third, the US needs to take steps to bolster deterrence and defense capabilities of the European and Asian alliances, including increasing conventional defense capabilities, deploying additional missile defense capabilities, and if needed, reviewing its non-strategic nuclear weapons posture in consultation with our allies. Now, these three measures are only the first step in strengthening reassurance and deterrence with alliance systems. The task force also outlined actions in multilateral deterrence in Asia and multilateral arms control to help rebuild US leadership. So with respect to multilateral deterrence in Asia, with Asia increasingly seen in Washington as the primary strategic and geopolitical theater of its global engagements, it's increasingly critical for the United States and its principal allies to coordinate strategy and combine efforts. Therefore, the United States should prioritize reestablishing strong trilateral security cooperation with Japan and South Korea, which is a prerequisite both to address the North Korean threat and to build a multilateral security framework within Asia as a whole. The United States should create an Asian nuclear planning group, bringing Australia, Japan, and South Korea into the US nuclear planning processes and providing a platform for these allies to discuss specific policies associated with US nuclear forces. With respect to multilateral arms control, the biggest nuclear unknown is in fact the scope and eventual scale of Chinese nuclear deterrent forces. Arms control can play a role in penetrating China's nuclear capacity, providing greater transparency about its capabilities, an exchange of views on intentions, and enhanced stability in the overall nuclear relationship. An expanded arms control framework should include a multi-pronged effort. Now, the following points. Following the extension of a New START, the United States and Russia should negotiate a new bilateral arms control agreement. The 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council should engage in strategic dialogue on nuclear weapons issues, the impact of these new technologies, and other critical issues. The P5 should negotiate nuclear confidence building and transparency measures, which could include as a first step invitations by the United States and Russia to representatives of the other nuclear powers to observe inspections that both countries conduct as a part of our existing arms control obligations. Finally, efforts to multilateralize nuclear arms control should place particular emphasis on engaging China, which could include engaging China in dialogue akin to the Strategic Arms Limitations Talks or SALT talks, and also allowing China to participate in New START monitoring as first steps. Now, what has been laid out, what I just covered in the report, is a challenging agenda, but an urgent one. If the alliance structures that have been the foundation of security in Europe and Asia are not rebuilt, the question of nuclear proliferation among our allies could once again be on the agenda. Again, Mr. Hahn, thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight.
Thank you very much, General Scaparotti. Now I see the faces of former Prime Minister Lee Hong-koo participating. Also, former Minister of Foreign Affairs Yoon Byung-se, who is scheduled to be the next speaker of this meeting. So without further ado, let me ask Minister Yoon to give his thoughts on the issue and the report.
Can you see this one-page PPT clearly?
Yes, we can do.
Okay, all right. Good morning in Seoul and good evening in the United States. Let me first thank Mr. Han, Chairman of the Asan Institute and President Dada of the Chicago Council for hosting this timely webinar. I'm also happy to join General Scaparotti, longtime friend of Korea, in presenting this TF report. General Scaparotti has done an excellent summary of what our TF report means for the United States, Europe, and Asia in general. And he covered part of my presentation as well. On my part, I try to focus more on its policy implications on the Korean Peninsula and Asia, including ROK-US alliance. Speaking straight, this report is dire warning about the possibility that what has long been unthinkable can become thinkable once more, as General Scafarotti has mentioned, meaning nuclear genius can come out of the battle of US allies and partners, not just the troublemakers. And this is related to the question Minister Han asked about the title itself. Thus, it calls for urgent actions to redress the problems, especially to strengthen nuclear deterrence and reassurance for them in diverse ways. It reminds us of President de Gaulle's famous question 60 years ago, before France went nuclear. Can the United States trade New York for Paris? In the Asian context, we could ask, can the United States sacrifice New York or LA for Seoul or Tokyo? From the TF standpoint, the rationale for these misgivings is very clear. As General Scafarotti mentioned, triple threats or challenges from a resurgent Russia, a rising China, and a nuclear North Korea are greater than before. But credibility for the United States nuclear and security guarantee was low, especially during the Trump administration. Like Trump's questions in response to the North Korea's short-range missile tests in violation of UN Security Council resolutions, raising worry about abandonment and decoupling. As a consequence, it accentuated the deterrence reassurance dilemma in a new form for America's European and Asian allies. A salient case in point is North Korea. This is the second question of Minister Han. KIF report highlights the fast-growing North Korean nuclear and missile capability, including between 50 and 70 nuclear warheads, and calls it an existential threat to South Korea and Japan and beyond. Recently, we have witnessed a series of worrisome developments, such as 1, North Korea's test of 2 Iskander missiles, 2, its announced plan to further develop tactical nuclear weapons, and 3, a UN Security Council expert panel report that the DPRK probably can fit its nuclear warheads with any kind of missiles. Combined together, the temptation of North Korea to use or threaten to use nuclear weapons is also increasing. This means that for Koreans, every day will be Cuban Missile Crisis. Under these circumstances, KIF report points out diverse South Korean opinions, ranging from much closer nuclear planning and sharing arrangements, including the redeployment of US non-strategic nuclear weapons to South Korea, to developing a national nuclear deterrent capability. Against this background, KIF report makes many action-oriented recommendations for the Biden administration with great implications on South Korea, and some of them are mentioned by General Scafarotti, to rebuild US leadership in 4 different areas. I'll do in my own way. Number 1, in commitments. Number 2, capabilities. Number 3, nuclear dimension. And then number 4, regional framework. I describe them as 4 ups. First, commitment up. KIF report recommends the United States to reaffirm America's security commitments for its allies in Asia, to reestablish the credibility of the US security guarantee at the earliest possible opportunity, and to demonstrate that commitment in new and evident ways, including nuclear dimension. It also recommends the United States to recommit to retain existing US troop levels in Asia for the foreseeable future. Secondly, nuclear dimension up. TIP report recommends the United States to, as General Scaparotti mentioned, to proactively raise the salience of nuclear weapons issues in its alliance relations, including by 1, bringing allies into a nuclear planning process from the outset, by 2, increasing alliance crisis management exercises that involve a nuclear dimension, and by 3, involving alliance leaders at the highest level in regular war gaming. Thirdly, capabilities up, both conventional and nuclear. TIP report recommends the United States to take at least 3 key steps to bolster the deterrence and defense capabilities of the Asian alliances. This was mentioned by General Scaparotti, but I review it once again, such as 1, increasing conventional defense capabilities in Asia, 2, deploying additional missile defense capabilities, and 3, if needed, reviewing its non-strategic nuclear weapons posture in careful yet serious consultations with all relevant regional allies to assure the adequacy of its forward-based systems and commitments. As we understand, the forward deployment of US non-strategic nuclear weapons and dual-capable systems in Asia, if realized in the future, is compatible with the NPT, like in Europe, and is a much better option than independent nuclear options of US allies. For example, a conditional redeployment of the tactical nuclear weapons until North Korea's denuclearization would be a very pragmatic instrument that can rectify precariously lopsided strategic imbalance on the peninsula. Fourthly, structures up and wider, meaning go multilateral. TIP report recommends the United States to renew and rebuild alliance structure and framework, and makes 3 key recommendations for multilateral deterrence and collective defense in Asia. Actually, this was mentioned by General Scaparotti as well, but I'll do it in my own way, that I used to call it 3, 4, or 5 approaches, or 3-some, 4-some, 5-some approaches. First, threesome. TIF report recommends the United States to prioritize reestablishing strong trilateral security cooperation with Japan and South Korea, which is a prerequisite both to address the North Korean threat and to build a multilateral security framework within Asia as a whole. As we all know, the United States is now working very hard through 2+2 ministerial meetings last month and trilateral NSC chiefs meetings last week. The second is foursome, and a very innovative idea. The report recommends the United States to create an Asian Nuclear Planning Group, ANPG, to embrace multilateral nuclear planning and deterrence, much as it has in the NATO context. This ANPG would bring Australia, Japan, and South Korea into the US nuclear planning processes and provide a platform for these allies to discuss specific policies associated with US nuclear forces and conduct war games and exercises, including those involving the highest political level participation. This ANP's idea now enjoys a growing interest and support in South Korea from many opinion leaders. From my standpoint, this ANPG, if created, will serve as the first ever regional framework to deal with North Korean nuclear threat and reassure South Korea and its key Asian allies, reinforcing existing bilateral working level nuclear consultation mechanisms. It could hopefully pave the way for another pillar, i.e., a NATO-type nuclear sharing arrangements in the future. The third is five-some, Quint, or Quad Plus. The report recommends the quadrilateral security dialogue partners to consider the eventual inclusion of South Korea in their dialogue. For South Korea, Quad, together with the trilateral security cooperation among US, Korea, Japan, could serve as a key platform to address issues of common concern in the free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific, including North Korean nuclear threat. At this stage, the current Korean government seems to be cautious on early participation. In due course, South Korea could join the Quad separately as Quint or with two other potential candidates for Part 3. The longer we delay, the bigger opportunity costs will be borne. In concluding, South Korea will benefit from working closely with the United States and partners in Asia and Europe in rebuilding alliance structures and enhancing nuclear posture. Actually, this is related to the another question raised by Ms. Han, the relations between Asia and Europe. So we have to rebuild alliance structures and enhancing nuclear posture, both transatlantic and trans-Pacific. And finally, as you understand, these TIF recommendations are individual views and not representing their governments. But I believe that they are the outcome of collective wisdom of TIF members who have been through the turbulent times over the last 4 decades inside and outside the government. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will have time to discuss the presentations that have been made by General Scaparrotti and Minister Yoon, both of whom participated in the task force that issued the report a few weeks ago. The third person to speak will be Dr. Ko Myung-hyun, a senior fellow at Asan Institute for Policy Studies.
Thank you, Mr. Han. So it's nice to meet you all, and it is a great honor for me to be able to participate in an event with so many elder statesmen that I've been looking up to for such a long time, even though some of you I'll be only meeting you virtually. So someday I look forward to meeting you in person. So I guess my role here, my contribution to the event will be more about commenting on the outcome of the report that the Chicago Council has published. I think the complements some of the research that we've been conducting here at Asan, in collaboration with the RAND Corporation in Santa Monica, United States, that we've been looking into how to counter the increase in the North Korean nuclear threats and missile threats of the last decade or so. Okay? Talk here. So I raised my voice a little bit so that you can all hear me better. So as I been saying, I think the greatest contribution of this report in many ways will be the reaffirmation of the fact that the confirmation of the fact that the trust of the United States policy, especially in terms of extending deterrence to its allies around the world, is broken. I mean, the last 4 years, in many ways, has shown that the commitment has been, the U.S. commitment to extending deterrence has been deteriorating around the world, and it's very healthy for the Chicago Council to trying to restore the balance and the credibility by bringing up, by putting on the table 3 important recommendations. I think the main point about constituting an Asian nuclear planning group to reassure the allies is very much welcome. And also the emphasis on the trilateral security cooperation between Korea, Japan, and the United States that Mr. Yoon has emphasized in his presentation is very much agreeable from our point of view. And also, what's actually very refreshing was the reconsideration of bringing back non-strategic or tactical nuclear weapons to the region. This is something that the ASEAN as an institution has been advocating all this time, and it's very welcome to hear. Very nice to hear this, and also I think it's very good to hear that there's an emerging consensus about the need to counter the nuclear threats posed by North Korea by engaging in the unthinkable idea of bringing back the tactical nukes. But having said all this, I think the recommendations outlined in the report it pretty much constitutes the baseline response to the growing and serious threat posed by not just North Korea, but other nuclear states such as China and Russia. There's a recommendation about rebuilding the multilateral security framework in terms of lending reassurance to the allies in the Asia-Pacific region. But I think we have to think about this more carefully and more tailored manner. I think that there's still a tendency to isolate North Korea's nuclear threat from the overall picture, overall strategic picture in the globe right now. There's a lot of comments on the right now, not just in the report, but in the policy establishment about how to counter the rise of China and then the rogue behavior by Russia. But I think especially in the European side, I would say. And then there's also at the same time, we try to think of North Korea as an isolated case, as an outlier. Therefore, we have to handle this in a different way. And I think that could be problematic in a way, in the sense that I think we cannot really set aside North Korea as a different problem because North Korea is going to play a major spoiler in the overall strategic picture in the next 5 years or so. We are estimating that North Korea already has between 60 to 120 nuclear warheads. We have to put this in a scope, the comparison with the strategic capability of China. China is estimated to have 300 nuclear warheads. And we expect North Korea to reach that level actually very quickly in 5 or 10 years, 10 years maximum probably. And not just that, we know that North Korea is developing and improving its ICBM capability with and then which likely that North Korea will possess between 15 to 25 ICBMs in 5 years' time too. And the implication of this is that North Korea's nuclear and missile capability will soon be able to overwhelm the missile defense system of the United States. We know that the report makes a strong recommendation to improve and enhance the missile defense system, but then it's likely that the North Korea's capability will soon overwhelm the current capability, and the United States will be under tremendous pressure to expand the missile defense capability. But this is not a technological challenge. It is also a strategic challenge. North Korea is going to play a spoiler in the sense that as we counter as an alliance, the growing North Korean threat will be at the same time undermining Chinese deterrence posture. So how to reassure not just the allies, but to reassure the Chinese that the strategic balance is still maintained is going to be a growing problem. And very soon, I think it's going to, in the sense that in that sense, I would say that our efforts to create and restore the trust and extend the reassurance to the allies in the Asia-Pacific region is going to be under growing pressure, not just from by North Korea's technical capability, but also pressure from the Chinese. And I think that's something that we should address in the near future, because that's going to be a major, major dilemma, not just for South Korea, but also for the United States and even the European allies. So with that, I'm going to wrap up my remarks, and we go into the Q&A session so that we can actually address this challenge in a more in-depth manner. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the three presenters. It's time for discussion. I take my privilege as moderator, and I would like to ask one more detailed, concrete question to General Scaparotti. One of the things that the report emphasizes is the importance of multilateral deterrence. And it seems that the nuclear planning group in Europe is something unique, something that Asia is totally missing. And the report recommends, while strengthening the nuclear planning group, US should create an Asian nuclear planning group. I would like to know, what will it look like? Who will be its members? And what will they do? And what will be the feasibility of creating such a mechanism? General?
Yeah, thank you, Minister. I can only address that from my personal experience. But if you go back to NATO, the nuclear planning group there has experts from each of the countries. And when I say experts, it's both diplomatic and military experts that provide counsel within that group. And that group has a greater responsibility then to report out to the North Atlantic Council. So within that group, you address the posture you need, the capabilities you need, the training that needs to take place and when that should be done, any emerging threats and whether we have the appropriate counter to that and how we would do that. I mean, it's all of those issues that should be addressed. They're done as a group of allies within that planning group. Now, another part of that is that planning group extends to the key ministers within each of those countries as well. I think that's an important aspect because deterrence today, particularly strategic deterrence, is much more difficult than it was in the Cold War, for instance. You have the speed of information, the speed of influence on people. You have emerging technologies that have to be taken into account along with the nuclear deterrent aspect. And so all of those things need to be considered. Within Asia, we don't have quite that group. We don't have a structured group of both diplomats and experts from each of the countries that exchange information, that can consult together on the best posture, that we should take within Asia. And also, I mean, part of that, as we mentioned in the report, was planning and wargaming. In the complexity of today's world and the complexity of deterrence in the 21st century, if our very senior ministers don't sit down and discuss the environment and potential scenarios that could come about, and in the calm, have discussions about the appropriate posture and response, if they do not do that, they will be caught very short in an unexpected crisis with very little time then to discuss those matters. So within NATO, for instance, it was always helpful to do those exercises and to have the ministers from each of the countries consider a specific scenario, educating them per se, but also then giving tasks back to me as the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe to provide them information on proper posture, respond to questions that they had. So, I mean, hopefully I've tried to outline for you, but I do believe that some type of planning group that's regional within Asia would be very helpful. And all of that then just reinforces the trust among the allies and the confidence in, as a group of allies, but in particular the United States' ability to credibly provide that extended deterrence that they count on.
So basically, the members were all from the NATO countries. Were there any from outside of the NATO?
No, not within the NATO planning group. There were not. It was the alliance. And of course, you have within NATO, France and UK that have nuclear weapons as well. And so they had a particular role in that because obviously they have very expert planners as well. And generally, as allies, we tried to ensure that we were open in our understanding and communications and planning.
Thank you very much. I sort of jumped the gun. Actually, we should have given some time to allow the speakers themselves to ask questions to each other and have mini discussion of some kind. So I'll do that. I just saw the hand raised by Minister Yoon. You want to come in?
Very briefly, following up to this General Secretary's explanation about the nuclear planning group in Europe. In the case of the future ANPG, Asian Nuclear Planning Group, basically the potential members are 4 countries: US, Australia, Japan, and South Korea, because there are already existing bilateral mechanisms between Korea and the United States, between US and Japan, between US and Australia. So these are very natural candidates for the future ANPG group. And actually in Europe, as I understand that this NPG is the most senior body that covers the most important issues. So in case Asian NPG is realized, they could benchmark the European model. And then finally, as General Secretary mentioned, one important the recommendations by the TF in several parts of the report emphasize the need for crisis management exercises. So in the case of this Asian NPG, they could talk about this kind of nuclear crisis management exercises as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions from the speakers themselves?
Well, Mr. Han, I'll just reinforce what Minister Yoon just said. When I mentioned wargaming, I actually more specifically meant crisis management exercises. That's what we conduct within NATO, and they're very, very enlightening. And I think in today's world, they're necessary, particularly at the highest level, the ministers themselves taking part in them.
So you're saying something like a planning group which will deal with not only nuclear issue, but the security issue generally.
Well, yes, it has to have a view of the environment, come together on that, and then from their assessment of the environment, do the appropriate planning with respect to nuclear forces. They report, in the case of NATO, to the ministers of defense. And so it is the nuclear planning group's job to do the work, and the ministers then discuss the outcome of that in terms of decision making, et cetera.
I think I saw a gesture from former Prime Minister Lee Hong-koo. It was a little like Karayan, so I didn't know whether you were actually asking a question or thinking, but please go ahead.
Very much, and it's a wonderful meeting, and the meeting which we very much need. And this Asan-Chicago Council meeting, I think has just started a very good series. I hope it will continue for a long time. Now, as for the issues at hand, again, the central focus should be US-China relations, because after the end of the Cold War between East and West, led by the United States and Russia, going back to 1988, so on, US and the international community did not have a clear understanding with China. That is, we all welcomed China becoming an important member of the international community and also becoming one of the P5s at the United Nations. But I'm not sure if China had the same understanding of the development at the time For example, if you become a member of P5 at the United Nations as one of the superpowers, among other things, you have a responsibility to keep the international agreements. For example, the example I like to cite is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So NPT becomes a very important agreement only because the major powers, as a member of P5 at the United Nations, fully support the spirit and the operation of NPT. But I'm not sure if China had that understanding with the United States and others, because China knew that North Korea is becoming the nuclear country. But I don't think either China didn't have the power to stop it or decide not to do it. In any case, the result is that it looked like China considered North Korea an exception to NPT system, and which is all right with China. Now this creates a tremendous problem regionally and globally. So I think with the new American administration, which has claimed that it will return to the leadership position and try to reassess the international agreements and arrangements, I think there has to be a very serious discussion between US and China on this point. That is, if China thinks there could be an exception to an NPT system like North Korea, does it also apply other neighboring North Korean and the Northeast Asian neighboring countries, for example, South Korea and Japan? Now, I have a feeling that that's not the Chinese position. North Korea is an exception, and a single exception they would like to support. And it doesn't make very much sense. So if and basic rationale on the part of North Korea to become a nuclear power is because they have a threat from the United States, the nuclear country. If that's the case, I think we have to now consider the possibility of doing something like Europe, which already General Scarpetti has just explained to us. That is why North Korea and China doesn't sign an international agreement like United States, Japan, and United States, South Korea. That is, if anybody, including US, is attacking China, I mean North Korea, China will automatically intervene and become a part of the conflict. As far as I know, there is no clear treaty between North Korea and China, or North Korea and Russia. So what I'm really saying is, it's about time that international system has to be rearranged and the NPT system has to be reviewed. And with the full participation of China, we have to revive the initial or commitment by all the parties in the international community. And that will help in Asia, the new age of peace, which is somewhat modeled after the age of peace in Western Europe after the First Cold War, because of the understanding and agreement between Soviet Union or then Russia and the NATO countries or Western European countries. I will stop here. And so I hope that US has to go into this major discussion with China, because it's very difficult for a country like Korea to enter into this type of discussion with China, because China is not used to talk with smaller countries. They only like to talk with the bigger countries like the United States. So we were hoping that there will be much more serious conversation between US and China on this question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think Ambassador An, who had served in the United States as Korean ambassador until 2 years ago, has something to say.
Thank you, Minister Han. General Scaparotti, so glad to see you again. Can you hear me well?
I can, Ambassador, and good to see you as well.
Right. Well, of course, I very much appreciate the fact that you are sharing your time with us. And at the same time, thank you so much for your very concise summary of all those important recommendations included in your report. And then, as you can see, one piece of recommendation which is attracting a lot of attention is something I would call Asian version of nuclear planning group. And I was wondering if I could make one comment and then two questions with respect to the Asian version of nuclear planning group. My comment would be this, which is I was just listening to you, the way how NATO nuclear planning group worked, and you said it was not just a narrowly defined nuclear issues as such. It was much broader than that. Scope was much broader than that. I was listening to you, and then I was reminded of something called Extended Deterrence Strategy and Consultation Group. It's a rather lengthy name, EDSCG, and that's something we agreed to establish between Korea and United States, if you remember. That was during the time I was ambassador in Washington, and then Minister Yoon used to be foreign minister. And then that's precisely what we thought at the time, in the sense that, well, extended deterrence, of course, that in fact would be at the end of the day of very sophisticated and military planning, but at the same time, well, during normal times, then of course, the interface between diplomats and military generals could be enormously helpful. That in fact is the reason why we agreed between Korea and the United States to set up this extended deterrence strategy and consultation group. What in fact is interesting is, well, we agreed upon it, and then it has not taken place yet. So that's my comment. My question would be this, which is, well, about the ups and downs or benefits and certain difficulties of creating this kind of group in Asia. I think there is broad understanding about the benefits of this kind of group. And then as a matter of fact, I also support the creation of this kind of group. But at the same time, getting back to what you discussed in your group about this recommendation, I'm pretty sure you must have, well, in fact, took into consideration a lot of challenges and difficulties we would have to face in going all the way to the creation of this kind of group. So I was curious, to the extent possible, if you could be sharing with us what were the disadvantages you discussed in your discussion in the group. My second question would be this, which is, I'm just listening to you and can see a lot of benefits of Asian version of nuclear planning group. And then I think what is we are assuming is that there will be deployment of tactical nuclear weapons in Asian allies of the United States, like Korea, Japan, and Australia. But at the same time, I'm just listening to you, and I tell myself, even if we do not deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Korea, Japan, and Australia, this kind of group could in fact bring us a lot of benefits. That's what I'm thinking listening to you. So those are two rather specific questions, and I want to raise them with you. But thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. It's always good to see you again. I enjoyed our time together as well, working on these tough issues. First of all, as you noted, the working group that we had in Korea was designed, and actually, my memory is that the Republic of Korea requested that in order to have greater insight into our planning on our nuclear systems, we were running, when I was there as a commander, we would have bomber excursions, et cetera, come in. But I think rightfully the Republic of Korea said, we want more information on this. We want to understand better how these fit into our overall plan. I think that's reasonable. Now, having said that, and being quite frank, what I experienced in Korea compared to what I experienced in Europe was quite different in terms of the level of information shared, et cetera. And I think that's where we need to go, because through that kind of exchange, one, there's a great deal of assurance built. It builds trust. And two, what I found in Europe is it actually a grouping of allies of the same mind actually usually comes out with a better outcome than, say, just the United States. So that kind of planning with the Republic of Korea and the United States, those two, is usually better than one. You have a different frame of reference. You take into account the different nations' concerns. And that would be the same with a more regional one in Asia. So I found benefit from all those things as a commander. Now, what are the downsides? Well, one of the downsides is this is sensitive information. So it has to be done in a way that we know it can be secured. And every country will have that concern. And so it's not a thing that's done quickly, and it's not done lightly. It takes time to develop that bond of trust with what information we share and how we use it. That's one of the things. There's risk involved. And the second, obviously, is that, some nations see this as more provocative than deterrent. And I think you have to take that into account as well. And that has to do with how forthright the allies would be about the purpose of this nuclear planning group and how it'd be used. But personally, my personal opinion is the deterrent factor is much more important to me, and particularly in today's world. As I said, Republic of Korea is in a difficult spot, as is the United States in that area, but then we have China involved as well. So this is a very difficult problem, but I think it's actually one that can be better dealt with as a group of allies with common objectives, and it'll be a much greater deterrent factor than if we do it separately or try to.
Thank you. I think I saw General Chung Sing-jo, who worked with you, General Scaparotti. He wants to make a comment, please. General Chung.
Thank you, Mr. Han. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you for very good presentations by great persons. Especially, I'm very glad to see General Scaparotti through this net. When I think about the North Korean nuclear threat, I always have two important things. First one is how to denuclearize North Korea. The second one is how to deter the utilization of nuclear bomb. But in a military point of view, I think we need to have more weight to the deterrence of the usage of nuclear capability by North Korea. When I think about the deterrence, I believe we need some lines of effort. First one is we need to have more detailed, extended deterrence plan, especially by the United States. I hope to share it with the Republic of Korea. And with that detailed, extended deterrence plan, we need to exercise it through sometimes PTX, sometimes CPX, hopefully by FTX. It will be much helpful to deter the North Korea to use the nuclear capability. And second, the line of second thought is, sometimes we say about nuclear sharing. There is my question to General Scaparrotti. Based on your experience in Europe, how can United States apply the nuclear sharing plan to Korean Peninsula? Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I saw a two-finger hand of Minister Yoon. You want to come in now?
Thank you. This is relating to the comments made by Ambassador An as well as Chairman Chung. Actually, as regards first extended deterrence strategy and consultation group, and also ANPZ. Actually, I was the person who made a very strong recommendation to create this extended deterrence strategy and consultation group, which is vice ministerial level, number 2 level. Before it was deputy ministerial level, focused on the military affairs. I wanted to expand that to not just the military, but also foreign policy areas as well. So it was a great idea, and there was a great resolve on the part of the two leaders in the United States and in South Korea. But unfortunately, with the change of government, it was not followed up until recently. So we need to revitalize that group bilaterally. In the same context, there are separate the nuclear consultation mechanisms between US and Japan and US and Australia. So I think as long as we have the resolve to utilize this kind of ideas, it will not be very difficult for the United States to convene all these countries together, because we have 3 separate bilateral mechanisms, and there has been the accumulation of the wisdom and the experiences. And then there we could exchange a lot of sensitive information as well, just like in NATO. And finally, this is regarding the comments by Ambassador An. When I proposed this idea of ANPZ during this TF deliberations, I was thinking about the possibility that this ANPZ idea could exist even before the existence of the nuclear sharing arrangement. This is for the same reason why Ambassador An mentioned, because the meeting together on the level of the very senior leaders through the ANPZ itself will be sending a very important signal to North Korea, China, and Russia, any other country. And also we can combine our wisdom together to tackle this North Korean nuclear threat. So even without the existence of this nuclear sharing arrangement or the forward-based the tactical nuclear weapons, we could proceed to create this ANPZ. I think step by step, we could move toward the next level of our cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Chekon.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this webinar, and also I wholeheartedly welcome the recommendation you made, because actually Asan has been advocating those recommendations for a long time. So now those recommendations are accepted and well printed in your report. I have a couple of questions, more technical questions. One, of course, one of the recommendations in the report is upgrading the missile defense. Can you be more specific about the strengthening and upgrading the missile defense? Do you think we need to have I don't know how many batteries need to be deployed on the Korean Peninsula, because actually North Korea is developing tactical nuclear weapon with the short-range missile. They have conducted the short-range missile test a couple of weeks ago. So actually, how we can upgrade the missile defense on the Korean Peninsula or Northeast Asian theater. Second, when MPG is introduced, when nuclear sharing mechanism introduced, I think we have to think about what would be the proper structure of a combined forces command. Because actually the strategic forces are under the control of STRATCOM and the direct control of the United States president. So I was told that when the Extended Deterrence Committee meeting was held, South Korean side asked some information about nuclear weapons or war fighting. They say it is executive right. We don't say, you can't say anything. So actually, I'm very struck that what has made you change your mindset, and that actually leads to the combined forces commander structure. So it's going to be more complicated than you think. And third related question is about wartime operational control. So I think combined forces command and wartime operational control go side by side. So if we introduce NPG and nuclear sharing mechanism, do you think we need to have a current combined forces structure and then delay the OPCON transition? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The time is getting near where we have to close. I'm supposed to make a closing remark, but let me just raise one question before I do that. And this question is, again, to General Scaparotti. Any multilateral deterrence requires the need for the members of this group to have same or similar objective and outlook. And in this case, in dealing with the North Korean nuclear issue, I'm not sure how much our own government shares all the objectives and concerns that some other governments in the alliance have. We're going to have an election, presidential election next year, a year from now, and we don't know what the result of that election will be. Usually, the Korean politics tends to have pendulum-like movement, so it moves from progressive to conservative and back and forth with some intervals. In any case, on the issue of threat perception, the South Korean government tended to coincide with that of President Trump, former President Trump, who didn't seem to feel that the threat is that great. Now, on missile defense issue, we have a problem in dealing with China, and the South Korean government, the Moon government, dealt with the issue in a way that has bound our hands. If an issue like the nuclear planning group comes up, I don't know the present government will support that kind of a plan. They have different views on joint US-Korea military exercise or possibly on the issue of nuclear sharing. I would like to ask you, General, I hope the United States understands the prevailing view within Korea that we would like to work very closely with the United States and cooperate in this multilateral deterrence as much as possible. How much patience does the United States have in dealing with South Korea? 1 year sounds like a very short time, but it could be a long time. And if we cannot guarantee that after 1 year, everything else will change, still we will have to work toward cooperating and sharing our views and concerns together. Do you think this is an unnecessary concern, or what kind of atmosphere can you tell us about the United States?
Well, obviously, this is my personal opinion, Minister, but I think actually the United States has a good deal of patience if you consider it from the common objectives that, you know, our alliance with the Republic of Korea has been based upon. I mean, there are broad, basic objectives I don't think there's any argument about. It comes down to how do we, you know, the real differences that come about are often about how do we enact or what actions do we take to reach our broader objectives. And my experience has been now in 2 alliances that that's not unusual, but strong alliances continue to talk, and they do so candidly about their differences. You know, I experienced in Europe over the, you know, my last tour, a great deal of difference at a political level within the alliance, and yet you saw them make major decisions time and again at 30. They came together on the very broad ones, and because of that, I tend to believe that as long as we're talking and we're candid and we can be trusted to be candid with each other, we actually strengthen that alliance. And in a longer term, we'll get to where we need to be. It's that same perspective that I think if you look at a regional alliance, that while many of the governments may have a different view about the environment itself, the security environment, they can come together and at least understand each other's areas where they are aligned and where they're not. And that in and of itself is very helpful.
Well, thank you very much for that statement. I feel relieved about the patience that you talked about. I think this morning we had, well, your evening, we had a very good discussion and very serious one, and insightful and illuminating points have been made. And thank you very much for all the participants. I hope that having read the report, the United States and its allies will take the points that the report makes and work very hard to realize both of this, which is preventing nuclear proliferation and reassure American allies, but at the same time achieve multilateral deterrence. So thank you very, very much for all the participants. I will stop the webinar at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. So I have one final announcement to make. Exactly 6 days from now, the same time, April 13, the ASEAN will host another webinar on the same subject, the rollout event of the final report of ASEAN-RAND joint study on North Korea's WMD. I'm sure General Scaparrotti, you're gonna love it. We have made the same kinds of recommendations, but more specifics. We actually include the exact number of tactical nuclear weapons we need to have on the ground. Thank you. Without further ado, let me
Thank you.
conclude today's seminar. Thank you. I hope you see you in 6 days.
Thank you.
Thank you.